So this week's movement breakdown, we're gonna go over single arm cable lateral raises. So I actually really love bilateral cable laterals where you would do a lying variation, and I've seen people do lying variations in between functional trainers. I've seen them try to do it with cable crossovers like this, or even with like seated cable rows, and inevitably, there's always just some differences there. But whenever we're performing a single arm cable lateral, there are a few differences here that we need to focus on to actually make this a really beneficial movement, especially as it compares to either a bilateral cable lateral or a seated or standing dumbbell lateral raise. So there are gonna be very different movements. So the first thing we wanna pay attention to here is the height of the cable. So we could go all the way down to the ground, but we would have to adjust our torso angle or our distance from the cable stack to create the best actual line of tension. What I did here is actually brought it up about 12 inches here off the ground so that the cable is starting from a position that is almost perpendicular to my arm at the bottom. And that actually lines the force up very well with my delts. So at the bottom, rather than being right on top of it like this and having a very steep upward angle, I'm a little bit further out, and that actually creates a much better resistance curve whenever I perform the full movement like this. There's no dead spots. Even at the top, there's no dead tension areas, which is exactly what we want from a cable variation. So the second thing I'll talk about here is handle versus some kind of strap. So I was just using the handle. Most people have a handle in every gym. They just come with cables. It's crazy. I prefer having some kind of strap. This is a multi-purpose, multi-utility strap. You can use it for your ankle, you can use it for your wrists, whatever. But these are actually gonna be much better because you're not going to be limited or hindered by your wrist or by your grip strength. So whenever you can move that anchor point, that pivot point higher up on your wrist or on your forearm, you're gonna be able to handle much more load. You'll be able to distribute it into your delts much better. So here, I'm gonna go ahead and take the cable attachment off. I'll put this on my wrist really quick just to show a quick demo. And then we will get into it. So here, I'll just hook it on just to get an example. Just like this. And you can see how it actually creates a different pivot point versus it being further out. Same thing as if you were to be doing a dumbbell, keeping your arm straight like this versus keeping your elbow a little bit bent. So it's just creating a different force at your delt. But in my opinion, having the strap or having this cuff is more beneficial. So last thing that we're gonna look at here is actually going to be the angle that you're going to be raising the cable at. So up until now, you've seen how I'm basically keeping that cable right along my midline, right along my body, and I'm working in this frontal plane. So you also can bring it a little bit out and work in more of a scapular plane. By scapular plane, I just mean instead of like this straight out to my side, I can bring it a little bit more forward to create a better tension, better response at my delt without jamming my shoulder joint up. So here, what that would look like is slight angle of my torso and my hips and just bringing it a little bit more forward rather than straight out to the side. And for most people, they'll find this way more comfortable than, again, right in that straight sagittal plane where a lot of people start to get jammed up in their shoulder. So let's go ahead and go over some really common mistakes that I see whenever people are performing their single arm cable laterals. So I mentioned it briefly when talking about the cues, but the absolute biggest issue I see people make is not actually lining the tension of the cable up with the movement of a lateral raise here. So what I mean by that is the cable is your friend. The cable has a consistent, even amount of tension no matter where you are in the movement. It's up to you to actually line your body and align your torso to get the most out of that. So we already talked about having this cable a little bit elevated off the floor rather than all the way down. Now we can talk about what to do with your torso, what to do with your body to actually change that tension and change how it feels at the delt. So, if we want to walk further out, we can see that as we bring the cable up, this angle is very, very close to parallel at the top. So there's not a lot of tension at the top of the movement versus if I'm really close like this and I bring it up, you'll see that the steepness has increased drastically. That means that it's gonna be very, very tough at the top here. So if you want to, you actually could, to make it a little bit easier, step out and step back in, or you could adjust your torso sideways or up. So I've also seen people, or recommended people, to lean like this to create a different stimulus, or stand up tall to create a slightly different stimulus. This is all gonna be based on what feels the absolute best for the trainee, and also how tense and how tensile the cable is compared to their delt strength. And that feeds right into another common mistake that I see people make whenever they're performing their cable laterals, is performing them on the wrong type of cable. So this cable, great, it's amazing, it's fine. I prefer people to use a functional trainer when performing any kind of cable lateral raise because it allows you to have a much greater margin of error whenever your strength isn't the absolute greatest. What I mean by that is because there are only a couple of pulleys here, we're not actually gonna get a ton of tension taken off of the movement. If you're working on a functional trainer, and a lot of people will understand what a functional trainer is if they've used one before, there's a bunch of pulleys in the system, which actually takes a lot of tension off of the movement at the bottom so that you could, start with like 2.5 pounds or 5 pounds, and you get a much more consistent amount of tension throughout the entire movement versus if I do this, there's a lag. I wouldn't recommend doing that, but there's always gonna be a little bit of a lag in this type of cable system versus if you were using a functional trainer, there really isn't that lag, so it just feels very smooth, especially for smaller body parts like your delts. And last thing that we're gonna talk about is actually what is the best way to approach the cable lateral if you want the most side delt stimulus, right? We already talked about working that scapular plane a little bit rather than in the straight sagittal plane, or frontal, excuse me. But if we are here, if we keep that cable right in front of us, and we work more in that scapular plane here, that's great. But what about whenever you see people keep that cable behind their back, which is pretty common? So where does this come into play? Do we ever want to do this? Well, my opinion, no, not really. That doesn't ever really seem to be a very successful outcome of any kind of cable lateral, especially single arm cable lateral raise. It's much better to keep the cable in front of you, to be able to stabilize yourself here, and to be able to work within different planes of movement that feel best for your own shoulder and your own anatomy. If that cable is going behind your back, you're very, very limited in where you can go because it's always going to be brushing up against your thighs or against your butt. So that's where we're at with the cable lateral raise. Again, I mentioned if you have access to a strap or any kind of cuff like this, I'd recommend using it. If you have access to a functional trainer or any kind of cable system that has more pulleys, a really robust pulley system, you want to use that as well. But even if not, you can make this work. It just takes a little bit more finesse.